Come on, there we go. All right, part 4, line. We're going to talk about line, which is just the continuous mark from one point to another that an artist makes. Descriptive lines. They mimic nature. They look like the world as we know it, versus expressional lines, the artist's interpretation. We're going to talk about all these kinds of lines and directionality, which are lines that aren't really lines. Don't worry, lots of examples as we do. All right. So, Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon, 1907. I don't speak French. I'm really sorry. All right. Say something clever. Point of view. I would say engaged, claustrophobic even. You are very close to these sort of scary women and they are all staring at you. Focal point. Have a little breeze around. I think you will fall on those 2 masks on the right side. And complementary color scheme, right? It jumps out at you that there's this pink skin on a blue background. So we've kind of built up from what we already know. Now, lines. Descriptive. Are women normally pointy? Not traditionally. So what we've got here, rather than being sort of descriptive lines, are expressional lines. These are these jagged, jolting, aggressive lines. Notice we've got sort of very geometric shapes going on in the women's figures. Very pointy things going on, but those pointy things are also mimicked in the background. So you've got these kind of aggressive lines in both the figure and the background. Having the same kinds of lines between figures and background actually quite flattens a piece, makes it feel like it has much less depth. But, you know, realistic is not what we were going for here, so that's sort of fine. All these angular geometric lines, they're, I guess I said the word aggressive, right? They're sharp, they're pointy. Curvy lines tend to calm us, are peaceful. Geometric lines are usually quite shocking. Pointy things are, you know, we're not usually cuddly with pointy things. Versus Picasso's Child Holding a Dove, 1901. So this was 6 years earlier. The line, what we have going on here is what you would call outline or contour line. It gives a very flat 2D feel. Think coloring book. A coloring book has black outlines around stuff so that you can color them in, but it never feels like a super realistic, in-depth portrait because you've got these black lines around everything. And in reality, there aren't black lines around everything we do. So descriptive lines, I guess they're outlining that shape. They are soft and rounded like the shapes of actual figures. But notice even the lines on the wall are curved and soft, and there's not a single straight line on here. That outline coloring book effect kind of gives it that 2D flat feel, but it's also softened with all of that curviness. So once again, it feels like it's a little bit in conflict with itself as far as what the message is, because we're getting that sort of flat, rigid, full outline 2D flatness. Like we've got flatness here from all the same line quality. We've got all the same line quality here as well, but this one is giving us that rounder, softer curve. All right, so once again, here, lines that aren't lines at all. We talked about Monet. Implied line. There are no drawn lines on these shapes. It's only the use of color to differentiate between the shapes. Look at the flags one more time. They're implied lines, but they're still naturalistic looking versus that sort of cartoony coloring book outline of the previous Picasso. You've got very realistic looking because in real life, shapes generally don't have a black edge to them. So it gives a very realistic feeling with that implied line, and our eyes very easily fill in those shape boundaries because we're used to defining shapes in reality that don't have black lines around them. So even though this is impressionistic, it's not meant to feel like a photograph at all. Your eye does an amazing job of sort of filling in the work of differentiating between the shapes without any lines there. So we call those implied lines. They're not really there. Your eye is doing that visual work all by itself. All right, so lines. Let's look at Durer's Last Supper, 1511. Check out that cross-hatching. It gives the illusion of space and mass. This whole thing is just lines. You can see here in the front, we've got hatching or parallel lines next to each other, making that sort of shadow and creating the three-dimensional depth here. Cross hatching is where we've got two sets of parallel lines that cross one another. Deep in the background, you've got the depth created by those parallel lines that both get closer together, and then you get the crossing here. So as you can see, wide apart creates less of a depth of shadow than close together. This technique is incredible because this is a woodblock print, which means the wood with everything cut away but the lines. So this is not an ink drawing where he just drew the lines. This is where he is carving out all of those white areas and leaving these tiny little thin strips of wood standing to then take the ink and be stamped like a stamp onto paper. So that white void space is what's manipulated. I think that sort of ups the game of how incredible these pieces really are by Durer. All right, so some Van Gogh, Starry Night, 1889. Expressional line. Every single brushstroke is a line. As you can see, every brushstroke is left as a very distinct line. There's an energy, there's a fever to this. The lines are not borders in reality. They are movement and expression purely from the artist's mind. They show movement. You've got line properties here. I would say that there's a directionality. So take a step back or scoot your chair back. Look at this as a whole. Directionality or directional line is when you look at big moves across the whole of the composition. Are you seeing this sort of move and tumble in a way across the scene? I think there's a definite directionality happening that then sort of gets cut or sliced by this foreground tree here. So the directional line is the aspect of an overall composition move rather than an individual drawn line. So Van Gogh creates that directionality through hundreds and hundreds of parallel individual lines that sort of share a direction. It doesn't have to be made up by a bunch of lines to create an overall gist of directionality. This one, Rubens' Follow the Rebel Angels, 18 teens-ish. The directionality or the directional line for this piece, if you just sort of cross your eyes and step back overall, there's a momentum, a direction to this piece with all these bodies toppling down from the top. The figures themselves create this overall huge directional line for the piece. Sort of, I'd say like upper right to lower left, right? We've kind of got this shot downwards and then some tumultuous stuff going on down here. So lines are sometimes lines that aren't made of actual lines. They're made of figures and light and color. All right, so for this one, Titian's Assumption of the Virgin, 1516. Directional lines. There are three. There's sort of three distinct zones in this painting. The composition of the directional lines is created by the figures, not necessarily any individual line. So you've got sort of the tops of the heads of the people, making that like bottom third zone. You've got this sort of cloud of cherubs sort of cutting off here in a bit of an arc. And then you've got this almost parallel line here that's cutting through with God and the angels. So you kind of can see these like straight line, curved line, slightly angled line that are kind of cutting this piece into three distinct sections. All right, so let's talk about the shapes of those overall lines. Humbert de Superville, which I'm sure in French it's not quite Superville, but how cool of a last name is that? He lived from 1770 to 1849. He did a study on the psychology of lines. Here's a page from it here. Basically what you're getting out of this is upslanted things are happy. When people smile, I know we are learning this a lot more now that you can't actually see somebody's smile under their masks. You can see the edges of their eyes rise. So upslant is smiling, is happy. We're social animals who read faces. So getting that upslant of an eye means a smile, means happiness. So it tends to also make us happy. We mirror that. Straight across, like straight lines, parallel lines, they're neutral. Downward slanting lines are sad or tired, or they just bring the energy down. So like complementary color science, artists kind of knew this and were using it a long time before de Superville did his scientific proof. So here we have Seurat's The Circus, 1891 again. Complementary color scheme, but that warm color palette dominates, right? The shapes are analogous warm color scheme with the complementary as the shadows. It gives you that happy feel. Again, pointillism. This is all just made up of thousands of tiny dots. There's not a single line on this page. So it's all implied line. But look at the curves all over the place here. Everything sort of flips up. His hat flips up, his fingers flip up, his costume flips up, that dude's mustache, everybody's hairdo, her little ballerina skirt. Everywhere that we can get a flip up, we get a flip up. Look at these like jaunty collars and shoulder pads and mustaches and costumes. Like everything is lifted at the corners. It's giving you that upslant, happy, happy, happy feeling from its line directionality. All right, let's wrap up line.